Yo! Lifelong Learner Bluewood here with episode 6 of the Azure AZ-104 exam prep series, Managing Azure Resources with Azure PowerShell. Thanks for tuning in. In this episode, the objectives that we will accomplish are to start a PowerShell session in Azure Cloud Shell, create a resource group and an Azure Managed Disk with Azure PowerShell, and then proceed to configure that managed disk with Azure PowerShell. So let's get right into it. For this episode and the next one as well, I'll be using the Azure Cloud Shell to run PowerShell and Bash commands. I'm not going to install and use the Azure CLI, where you could run the commands locally on your machine after connecting to your Azure subscription, but maybe I'll make another video on how to set Azure CLI up and link it to your Azure account. For now, I'll be using the Cloud Shell that's native to the Azure portal to ensure that everyone could follow along and accomplish the tasks that I'm going to be doing in these videos. For the AZ-104 exam, you have to be comfortable with the Azure portal, PowerShell, and Bash. Knowing some basic syntax for PowerShell and Bash is crucial and will be on the exam. In this episode, we'll be focusing on some basic PowerShell commands in the Azure Cloud Shell. First things first, let's open up the Azure Cloud Shell and ensure that we have a storage account linked to it. At the top right of the Azure portal, click on Cloud Shell. Then if you don't already have a storage account mounted, simply fill out your subscription and click Create Storage. This should only take a minute or two. After the Cloud Shell storage has been created and mounted, a PowerShell terminal should pop up, and now we could get started with writing our own PowerShell commands. At the top left corner of the terminal, we could simply swap over to Bash and start running Bash commands instead. But we will save that for the next video. Let's run some of the most common PowerShell commands in Azure. Let's first create a resource group with a PowerShell command. We want to create a resource group in the same location as the most previous resource group that we made, which would be Canada Central for me. So first let's create a variable called location, and let's assign it the same location as our most recent resource group, which was episode 5 resource group. Now this command, we're going to get the resource group named episode 5 resource group, grab the location and assign it to this variable called location. Let's create another variable and assign it a name for our resource group. Bear with me now, these variables will be used in just a second. Let's call this variable resource group name and assign it a name. Episode 6 resource group will suffice. Now let's use these two variables to actually create the resource group. The PowerShell command to create a new resource group in Azure is new AZ resource group. Give it a name and we'll utilize our variable, and then give it a location and we'll utilize the location variable. And there you go, our new resource group is created. As you probably already know, resource groups only have two parameters, and that's name and location. I'd like to mention that creating and using variables is not mandatory, but using them can provide accurate and organized resource orchestration. Let's go check out our new resource group and confirm that the parameters we set are true. So let's just minimize the PowerShell terminal, hop over to resource groups, and there it is, episode 6 resource group with the name that we assigned. And location, we can confirm that it is Canada Central, the same location that we used in episode 5. Perfect. To reopen the Cloud Terminal, simply click the Cloud Terminal icon in the top toolbar. PowerShell commands are often self-explanatory. For example, to create a new resource group, we use the new command. To get information about a resource group, what do you think we would use? Yep, you guessed it, the get command. So if I ran the PowerShell command get AZ resource group, and then gave it the name of the resource group that we just created, so episode 6 resource group, and ran that, it would give us all the information on the new resource group that we just created. Let's move on and create a managed disk in this new resource group. We're going to use the same parameters that we used for the other disks that we have created in some of our earlier episodes of this series. A cool feature in PowerShell is that we can enter the entire configuration for this new resource in one variable and utilize that when we create the resource. So the new variable we're going to create is going to be called diskconfig, and the PowerShell command to create a diskconfig is simply new AZ diskconfig. As mentioned earlier, some of these PowerShell commands are very self-explanatory. Just like the resource group that we created earlier, disk configuration has its own parameters. One of them is location, and we could simply use the location variable that we created earlier. As you can see, using variables is very beneficial when you're creating multiple resources at once. Next is going to be, I believe, create option, and we're going to leave that as empty. Next parameter is going to be disk size in gigabytes, and we're going to use that as, we're going to leave that as 32. And last but not least, the SKU, and we're going to leave that as standard LRS. I'm going to create another variable for the disk name. Let's just call it episode 6 disk. I just cleared the terminal, so now let's tie it all together and create the new disk with the variables we created. The PowerShell command to create a new disk in Azure is simply new AZ disk. The first parameter is resource group name, and we could utilize the variable we created earlier, rg name. The second parameter is disk name, and we could utilize the disk name variable for that. And then the last parameter is disk, and here we could utilize the diskconfig variable that we created that holds the entire disk configuration that we need. And there you go. Let's confirm that the disk was successfully created with the correct parameters. So let's just minimize the terminal for now, then hop over to episode 6 resource group, and there it is, the disk. If we check out the parameters, the configuration, yes, I needed it to be 32 gigs in Canada Central, and that looks good to me. Assume we made a mistake in the configuration for this disk and needed the size to be 64 gigs instead of 32. Let's open up the Cloud Shell and update the disk configuration. The command for updating the disk configuration is simply new AZ disk update config, and we're going to be only updating the parameter disk size, GB, to 64 gigs. Now we have to choose the actual disk to update. With that said, we're going to be using the update AZ disk command. And selecting the specific disk that we just created. So in this resource group, we're going to select the disk with the disk name episode 6 disk, which is in the variable disk name. Let's verify that the change took effect both in PowerShell and the Azure portal. In PowerShell, let's run the command get AZ disk, resource group name, and then the name of the disk. Notice we're still using the variables we created, but as mentioned earlier, this is not mandatory. And if we scroll up, let's check out the disk size and confirm that it is 64 gigs. Perfect. Now let's also confirm that the change has taken effect in the Azure portal. So let's just minimize the terminal. If we go back into resource groups, episode 6 resource group, and then check out the disk, we can confirm that it has been updated to 64 gigs. And that's the end of episode 6. If you followed this video, you have started a PowerShell session in Azure Cloud Shell, created a resource group and an Azure Managed Disk with Azure PowerShell, configured the Managed Disk with Azure PowerShell. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video or if it helped you even in the slightest, please like and maybe subscribe for future content. Additionally, if you have any suggestions or questions, please leave a comment down below and I'll be happy to help out any possible way I can. I'll see you guys in episode 7 where we will manage Azure resources by using Bash. Peace!